Start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name is Pedro dos Santos, and Professor of Political Science here at CSBSJU. This is the first of a series of talks that I called Spotlight on Brazil. This is part of my Brazil course, Post 380, Race, Gender, and Inequality in Brazil. I always forget what the order is, but it's all there. Inequality, gender, and race are in the title. I'm super excited about this group of talks. I want to thank the MacArthur Center for helping sponsor this too. And one of the cool things is that I'm able to bring some speakers to talk to the class on Zoom and to anybody else who wants to come, of course. But the students are going to meet these people in Brazil. So Dr. Vatin, we're gonna meet him later on in his home turf when we get there. So I'm excited. So first of all, this is an official event, so I'd like to do as well our late acknowledgement. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupied the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. So now students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native neighbors. So I want to introduce our guest today, Dr. Xavier Vatin. He's an Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at the Federal University of the Recôncavo of Bahia in Brazil. So he's an ethnomusicologist and has a BA in musicology from Université Sophia Antipolis. I'm not very good with the French stuff, and has an MA and PhD in social anthropology from the EHESS in Paris. His research is focused on Afro-Brazilian religions, ethnomusicology, visual anthropology, and Afro-Atlantic cultures and languages. He is author and co-author of several books, book chapters, journal articles, CDs, and documentary films in Brazil, France, the United States, Switzerland, and Germany. Dr. Vatin served as a visiting professor at Indiana University Bloomington in 2012, Université Lumière Lyon 2 in 2013, Université Côte in 2018, and in 2017, his Afro-Atlantic Legacies project, dedicated to the repatriation of African-American linguist Lorenzo Turner's 1940 Bahia recordings, was awarded the Prêmio Afro, Prêmio Nacional de Expressões Culturais Afro-Brasileiras in Rio de Janeiro. In 2019, Afro-Atlantic Legacies became a documentary film, and Dr. Vatin's ongoing research was awarded an Institute for Advanced Studies Summer Repository Research Fellowship at Indiana University. In 2021, the second volume of his project, funded by Rumos Itaú Cultural, was released, including a book, a 4-set CD, and a second documentary film. And today he's going to do a talk called Brazil Under U.S. Influence, 1964 to 2021. And the idea for the talk is he will speak for a little bit, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Some of my students have watched some of his recommended documentaries and readings, and then we kind of go from there for an informal conversation. So thank you, Dr. Vatin, and the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Professor Pedro. I'm very happy to be with you. And to know that we'll meet next month here in Bahia, in Brazil. That will be truly my first in-person meeting after 2 years when you come here, because unfortunately our university is not yet back in person. So I will be very happy to receive you here in Cachoeira, Bahia. So I have the challenge to talk about more than 50 years of Brazilian history and its connection with the United States in about 40 minutes. And since I thought the challenge was not enough, I think I'm going to start way back in the past. And I think it's needed, as Professor Pedro was saying, that the university and the state of Minnesota relies on the ground that belonged to Native Americans for centuries and thousands of years. We have first to remember that the history of man in South America and the history of man, especially in Brazil, started more than 100,000 years ago. I've been recently to the Serra da Capivara in the state of Piauí, and there is an amazing archaeologist called Nied Guidon, and she has shown to the world that the presence of human beings in South America, and especially in the heart of Brazil, started more than 100,000 years ago. So there is human presence in South America a long and way more long time that we used to think before. Before that, people thought it was 22,000 years ago. So the foundings of archaeology in the last 2 decades have shown amazing data proving that human beings have been here for a very, very long time. And I think it's very important to understand, and I'll try to explain the connection between the United States and Brazil, starting from these similar experience of 2 nations that supposedly started, in the case of Brazil, 522 years ago in 1500, as you probably all know. But obviously we need to remember that approximately 8 million people used to live on this ground before the arrival of Pedro Álvares Cabral, the first Portuguese to arrive in 1500. And all my presentation will be based on a comparison between the United States and Brazil, and to understand how these 2 nations, the 2 biggest nations in North America and South America, are connected in some ways. So first of all, I think we need to understand that both of these countries have been built since the very beginning of the European colonization on genocide, on slavery, and these 2 elements need to be acknowledged even today, more than 500 years later. We need to understand that there is a structural violence that makes our 2 countries very similar. There is a systemic racism also that we experience here in Brazil and that you still experience in the United States. And there is a weight of white supremacy in both our countries. And I think it's very important to start with remembering that Native Americans or Native Brazilians have been for hundreds and thousands of years on this ground. Most of them have been decimized, exterminated by genocide or by diseases. The population of the Americas in a whole, in 1492, when Columbus arrived, was something about 57 million people. And today, the 8 million native Brazilian that we had in 1500 are reduced to only 10% of what was the population in 1500, which means that less than 1 million native Brazilian still live in Brazil, 800,000. And I believe I need to speak about that too very quickly now, from this point, 1500, when Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived from Portugal here in Brazil, and to remember the first period from 1500 to 1822, which would be the colony period of Brazil under the Portuguese influence and Portuguese domination. And then in 1822, we have, as you probably may know, the Império. So the imperial part of the independence of Brazil starting in 1822 and going to 1889 with the First Republic. And all over the 19th century, there is a shift from the Portuguese influence to a British influence that economically is very important in the 19th century. And then I would say, to start my presentation, that from the beginning of the Republic in 1889, we can start to feel the US influence, starting at the end of the 19th century, and that's going to be stronger and stronger over the course of the 20th century. So, as you may know also, Brazil is the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. So exactly 1 year before the first republic in this country. That started with a coup. And we'll talk about three coups. The first one in 1889, I can't give you many details because I truly want to start in 1964, but we need to understand that there has been a focus in Brazil at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century to try to build a nation, to build a new nation on this republic. And one of the elements was to whitewash the population of Brazil, to consider that the African contribution was like a stain that had to be removed. And there is a very interesting connection between so-called scientific racism at the end of the 19th century, the way that eugenics have been built in the United States and in Europe, and the way eugenics have had an impact in Brazil by the idea and the ideal of whitewashing the population by receiving an amazing number of migrants that came especially from Europe, from Germany, from Italy, and then from Japan, and from different places in Spain, and in order to whitewash the Brazilian population. So the ideology in the 1930s and under Getúlio Vargas was to try to change these aspect of the population of the miscegenation by changing the structure of the population. Then now after World War II, when Brazil at the very beginning of the war was close in a way to Nazi Germany. As an example, Ruth Landis, who wrote an amazing book called The City of Women in 1938. She was a Jewish researcher that came to Brazil, and she did an amazing fieldwork here in Bahia. And when she arrived by boat in Rio de Janeiro in 1938, there was a portrait of Adolf Hitler at the customs in Rio. So there was an impact of Nazi Germany at the very beginning of the Second World War. And then when the United States entered the war in 1941-43, then Brazil aligned to the United States. And I would say that politically, that is one of the starts of the alignment of Brazil to the United States. So we are at the end of the Second World War, and then we pull to the end of the 1950s with Juscelino Kubitschek and a way of trying to modernize the Brazilian economy, politics, and the creation of a new capital in Brasilia. So Brazil had three capitals. First of all, Salvador, Bahia was the first capital. Then, as you probably may know, Rio de Janeiro. And at the end of the 1950s, Brasilia becomes the new capital under the presidency of Juscelino Kubitschek. And then in 1961, there is a new president, and the vice president, so we're approaching 1964, is João Goulart. João Goulart, as a vice president of Brazil, of progressive force of the center left, went to visit China and went to visit the USSR. And obviously, as you know, we are in the very middle of the Cold War. And the Cold War is going to be extremely important to understand the influence of the United States over the course of the 60 years here. So I would say we need to start in 1961 to understand what's going to happen in 1964 with the first coup d'etat I will talk about. So the vice president of Brazil visiting USSR 2 years after Cuba was taken by the communists and Fidel Castro, as you know. So there was, under the Kennedy presidency, a fear, an amazing fear that Brazil which is, as we know, the biggest country in Latin America, would shift to a communist regime. And obviously to Kennedy, it wasn't acceptable. So we need to talk about a figure that has had a very important role, who is Lincoln Gordon. Lincoln Gordon was the ambassador of the United States in Brazil. He started his term in exactly 1961, and he was an anti-communist. He knew a little bit of Portuguese, and he started exactly 1961 when Vice President João Goulart of Brazil, as I told you, visited the USSR and China and was very welcome in both these countries. And he started a program called the Alliance for Progress, Aliança para o Progresso, a program that would involve not only Brazil, but other countries in Latin America. And the United States obviously wanted to maintain their control over Latin America to avoid to have a second Cuba anywhere, in smaller or bigger countries. Just to remind you that Brazil is in size bigger than the United States without Alaska. So this is truly a huge country. So if you think of the impact of the shift of Cuba in 1959 becoming a communist country, I mean, a small island, if you compare it to the size of Brazil, it would, as I said, be absolutely unacceptable for the United States in this global context of the Cold War, 2 years after the very close to the missile struggle that happened between Cuba and the United States to have one more communist country. So the Alliance for Progress injected more than $10 million and $10 billion on the Latin American scale to avoid the rise of communism and to support right-wing regimes and parties in Brazil and in other countries in Latin America. In the 1961-1962 elections, the Alliance for Progress supported many parties of the right scale in Brazil and tried to avoid the shift to a João Goulart presidency. And even so, João Goulart was elected the president after the resignment of Jânio Quadros in 1961. So since 1961, the military in Brazil tried to start a coup d'etat, but they didn't achieve, even with the help of, the US background. So João Goulart had a 3-year term from 1961 to 1964. In 1964, he wanted to implement some reforms that would be extremely important from Brazil. The agrarian reform, the nationalization of Petrobras, the remaining places of oil and oil fields that Brazil has. Brazil is a country that is rich in oil. And so Petrobras, that is the national company that runs oil in Brazil. João Goulart, the president at that time, wanted to have all petrol controlled by the Brazilian state. And obviously it was against the US interest. So in the middle of March 1964, on Friday, 13 March 1964, João Goulart, feeling that the military could start a coup d'etat, tried to implement his reforms and had an amazing gathering in the center part of Rio, near the headquarters of the military, and even the Communist Party of Brazil that used to be forbidden by that time, in some ways participated to that movement. The involvement and the participation of Lincoln Gordon, the ambassador, was extremely important because he was directly connected first to President Kennedy, and after his assassination to LBJ, and had a direct connection with the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. And he was convinced that Goulart wanted to implement a communist regime in Brazil. And that's what he has been trying to convince the President of the United States. So a few days after this huge gathering of 200,000 people in Rio, backing the president, then the right parties in Brazil and the military had a march for God and a march para Deus. Can you remind me the name, Pedro? A march para Deus.
E pela liberdade?
And
Foi?
for liberty and for freedom. And more than 1 million or 2 million people were in the streets. So there was an economic crisis and under the Goulart administration that made that a lot of people were not backing the president. But the important part is that for the first time, there is an operation called the Brother Sam Operation that started in the embassy in Rio, and that was a call by Lincoln Gordon, the ambassador, directly to the president to have the military and to have military ships from the United States coming in front of Santos in the state of São Paulo, which is the main harbor that Brazil has. And so at the end of March 1964, on March 31, 1964, the Operation Brother Sam started, and all these ships and planes were taken to this area with support of oil and many things that would back a military coup in case needed. But the President João Goulart did not resist the coup, and the coup started obviously with the military and the generals. The top generals of the military in Brazil had direct contact also with Lincoln Gordon. So what I'm trying to explain is what Brazilian people have been knowing without proof, without formal evidence for more than 50 years. And why? Because it was only in 2014, exactly 50 National Security Agency started a program to open its files to have all the evidences. So the phone calls between Lincoln Gordon and Lyndon Johnson, and all the data and all the faxes that were sent. So everything has been gathered, but it was kept from anyone from 1964 to 2014. So Brazilian people have been waiting 50 years to have the evidence of the coup d'etat that was backed by the United States, especially by the CIA, and having a very important role, Lincoln Gordon, who was the ambassador of the United States in Brazil. The idea was to try to take João Goulart out of office and to stay for a year. The generals, officially the plan was for them to stay for a year until 1965. And as you may know, the Brazilian dictatorship lasted 21 years. This is the longest dictatorship in Latin America in the 20th century. One general after the other became president from 1964 to 1985. So this starts with the Cold War context. This starts with the fear of communism in the United States, and obviously the alignment of a very important part of the Brazilian elite to the interests of the United States. Obviously, the economic and the political elite and the military in Brazil didn't want that shift on the left side. That would never have been communism. Every political analyst on Brazil in the 1960s knows that Brazil would not become a second Cuba. And obviously the propaganda used by the generals and used by the ambassador of Brazil was, trying to use that fear of communism and that fear of the influence of the USSR to have this coup happen. In 1968, the dictatorship became stronger with the fifth institutional act, the Ato Institucional number 5, that banned parties and that took hundreds and thousands of Brazilians to prison, being tortured, and many of them being killed. So this was a bloody dictatorship. It went worse from 1968 on. And to understand the influence, because this is my topic today, how Brazil has been under US influence, starting especially in 1964, we need to understand that this starts with the Operation Brother Sam that was finally revealed 50 years later. Then in the 1970s, when, as you probably know, the democratic regime in 1973 in Chile is taken out by a very bloody coup d'etat backed by the CIA and the United States, taking Salvador Allende, the president of the left side, by Pinochet and his military dictatorship. So 2 years later, in 1975, we have another operation starting with the United States giving instructions and forming militaries from different countries in Latin America and Central America. And this is the Operation Condor. The Operation Condor that officially started in 1975 formed, as I told you, on US military ground in the United States and in Panama, formed military from these Latin American countries to counter insurgency, to torture, and to extrajudicial assassination. This Operation Condor resulted in 60,000 dead, without knowing of how many people disappeared and whenever their bodies were never found. So we need to understand that the United States, in this Cold War context and in this specific imperialist relationship to Latin America, and we need to remember the Manifest Destiny, is that word that you use in the United States, o Destino Manifesto, the Manifest Destiny that started this ideology at the end of the 19th century. So this idea that the United States had to take in hands the destiny of the rest of the Americas, of Latin America, of the Caribbean, and of South America, has gotten into a reality through this military operation and backing a lot of coup d'etat and most, or if not all, of the dictatorship of the 1960s and 1970s in Central and Latin and South America, were all of them backed by the CIA and the United States of America. So we go regarding Brazil, from the Operation Brother Sam to the Operation Condor, that lasted especially from 1975 to the very beginning of the 1980s. And then in the 1980s, finally, after almost 20 years of military regime in Brazil, there is a starting point of a path towards redemocratization that will officially start in 1985. So that's why we have this number of 21 years between 1964 and 1985. The redemocratization phases will be also accompanied by amnesty. So all the crimes that were committed during the dictatorship will be forgiven, and the military will be forgiven, and there will be no suing of any kind after this period of dictatorship. In 1988, there is the first election and the representing this redemocratization process and a new constitution for Brazil. This new constitution is the constitution we are living under until today of 1988, and it's often called the Citizens' Constitution, Constituição Cidadã. This constitution is in many ways a reaction to what happened during these dark 21 years of dictatorship. So it supposedly gives back to the people in Brazil some or even many rights. The first president of this era was impeached, and right after him, we have a center-right government by Fernando Henrique Cardoso in 1994. The end of this dictatorship era and the very beginning of the redemocratization starting in 1988 was also a dark period in the economy of Brazil. We had an inflation of more than 1,000% in 1982. I am French. I came to Brazil in 1992. And when I arrived, the prices changed every day. So 1,000% means 100% a month. So the first step towards stability, at least economic stability, has been given in 1994 when President Fernando Henrique Cardoso of the center-right of Brazil, and he was the Minister of Economy in the former administration, had the Plano Real, which was a plan to stabilize the currency by making $1 1 real, and the real is until today our currency. So it's been an amazing change in the history, and obviously also one more tie to the United States through this stabilization of the economy and making $1 equals 1 real. So it was a huge change, and Fernando Henrique stayed in power for 2 terms. The terms of a president in Brazil is the same as the United States. It's 4 years. So from 1994 to 2001, we were under the presidency of Fernando Henrique Cardoso of the center-right. And then finally, in 2002, was elected a man that was born in Northeast Brazil, which is the poorest area of Brazil, in Pernambuco, called Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, that I believe that many of you have heard of. Lula started his career as a metal industry worker, and then he started being extremely active in the 1960s against the dictatorship, and he started his career as a union worker. And so he, at the end of the 1970s, became extremely important in the process that went toward re-democratization at the end of the 1970s and beginning of the 1980s. He was the major figure of unionist in Brazil. Lula founded a party at the beginning of the 1980s called O Partido dos Trabalhadores, the Workers' Party, the PT in Brazil, in Portuguese. And this is the result of the convergence of these union workers and also of the theology of liberation that started within the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church during dictatorship was divided and strongly divided into two parts. The right part of the Catholic Church was backing the dictatorship, and that was, I would say, the major part of the Catholic Church. As you know, Brazil is, until today, considered to be the biggest Catholic country on earth, despite the growing number of newborn Christians and new evangelicals here in Brazil. But until today, the impact of the Catholic Church is very important in Brazil. And then the second part that split from the central and major influence of the Catholic Church under the dictatorship was the theology of liberation that was led by left-wing people within the church, and that converged politically with the interests and the ideals of the left and of this country, the Workers' Party created by Lula in the 1980s. Lula was a candidate to presidency since the very beginning of redemocratization. In 1988, in 1995, 1994, all the terms, and then finally in 2002, after 2 terms of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Lula is elected president of Brazil. His years in office are almost occurring at the same time as Obama in the United States. And this will be an interesting shift and change in the relationships of Brazil with the United States. First, we need to remember that other Latin American countries had left leaders in the years 2000, like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And probably until today, Venezuela has been seen like the biggest oppositor to the United States politics in Latin America since the change and the death of Fidel Castro. So Lula is also the symbol of the left emergence in Latin America, with Evo Morales in Bolivia, as I told you, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and so on. So that's an important change. Lula started to implement what would be called we could call a center-left government. He knew he had to navigate with a country that is extremely different from the United States, politically speaking, because we have multi-partyism. The multi-partyism that Lula faced when he was elected in 2002 was 35 political parties disputing on the political scale. So this is a democracy of coalition. You need to have coalition to be able to run a country. And Lula was, like his predecessors, was obliged to coalesce with the forces of the so-called center, which we call the Centrão here in Brazil. And these are what we call physiological forces in the political scale in Brazil, which means that these parties have no ideologies, and the only ideology they have is to stick to who's in charge, to stick with who's in power, and to have all the political benefits and the financial benefits of backing who's in control. And Lula, like any other president, had to make alliance with these people. But in 8 years of Lula's government, 50 million people in this country went from starvation to a low middle class. 50 million people that were under the line of poverty finally had access to a consumer society. So it was an amazing change. New universities were created. affirmative action program in universities were created. I'll give you an example. As I told you, I came to Brazil in 1992 as a French, believing in a racial democracy that Brazil has been selling as an ideology all over the 20th century. So I candidly believed that Brazil was a racial democracy, even without racism. And the first time I was invited to give a lecture at the University of Bahia in a state that 80 to 85% of people are Black, is to enter a classroom and to face only white students. So there was no segregation officially in Brazil, like you had in the United States until the 1960s, but racism is to many people considered to be even worse because it's never has been official in Brazil. But the consequences of racism are terrible. Now coming back to structural violence. Every year, almost 65,000 people are being killed in Brazil. The murder rate, assassination rate in Brazil is 6 times more than in the United States. So as you know, as we all know, as the world knows, the United States has a very high crime rate. Brazil is 6 times more. And within this number of 65,000 people being killed by gunfire every year, 77% of them are Blacks. So Lula had to face the situation of a country that for 5 centuries have been oppressing minorities, oppressing and killing and promoting genocide against native Brazilian, 350 years of slavery. Speaking of slavery, speaking of the African contribution to Brazil and the United States, Brazil received 5 to 8 million Africans during the slave trade, which is at least 10 to 15 times more the number of Africans that were taken to the United States, which makes that today, if we gather 2 categories of white or of Black people, pretos in Brazil, or pardos would be mixed race people tending to Black, 51% of the Brazilian population is Black today in Brazil. And when Lula took charge, took power in 2002, a very tiny number of Black people had access to higher education and to university. So through the creation of these new universities, through the creation of affirmative action programs and fellowships for poor students, it completely changed the face of Brazilian universities, and especially federal, state, public universities. Our university, the Universidade Federal do Recôncavo da Bahia, that I will be extremely happy to welcome you next month in May and to present to you, has officially 82% of Black students. So in less than 2 decades and in less than 8 years in office, Lula was able to change the structure, the demographic structure of higher education. And as we all know, this is the only way to change society. After 2 terms in office, and even being on the left scale of the political spectrum, Lula and Obama had, at least on the surface, extremely good relationships. I think Obama called Lula once the dude, saying that he was, o cara, the face of, of someone extremely important in the Americas, in Latin America. And after 8 years in office, Lula left with 82% of approval, his government. And then he was able to elect the first female president in the history of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, and I invite you, obviously you all know that Pedro has wrote a book on this Dilma presidency, so he is way more able than me to talk about the importance that the Dilma Rousseff presidency has had and how gender obviously has been a factor in the way she became president, but unfortunately in the way that she was removed by an impeachment in 2016, and how many of us, and I belong to this person who believe it was a coup in 2016, and she was removed from office in 2016. So during the Lula era, Brazil escaped even the global crisis of 2008 that started in the United States, the economic crisis. And the economy of Brazil was extremely wealthy until the end of Lula's term. And the redistribution policies that he implemented, giving a little help to these extremely miserable and poor people in Brazil, changed not only demographically, but also economically. So this redistribution of wealth that was not so strong as we may hope and expect, made Brazil in some ways be able not to fall into these economic crisis starting in 2008. But unfortunately, the crisis started to strike in 2012 and 13, and a movement against Dilma started at that time. Even so, she was re-elected after 4 years in office. But right after her re-election, she started to face a high number of critics that started under the Lula era, and accusations of corruption, not specifically against her, but against the Workers' Party. And then we need to talk, and I think we'll, for the second time, so we were in 1964, the Operation Brother Sam, in 1970s, the Operation Condor, and now we'll try to understand to what extent the United States have had an influence of what happened over the last 7 years in Brazil. So in 2015, after being recently re-elected, Dilma Rousseff was attacked of all parts in Brazil, and especially by the right that lost the election for a very tiny percentage. And the starting of an impeachment process for a motive. The reason was about an economic way she dealt with the how do you say, the budget, the federal budget. So what happened? A judge started to investigate and to create a movement called Operation Car Wash, that maybe you've heard of, Operação Lava Jato. And the press backed these Operation Car Wash. And during months and years, this judge called Sergio Moro, that speaks English way more fluently than I do, and that had been formed and had very tight connection with the CIA in the United States, started to officially to start a struggle against corruption in Brazil. And the Petrobras, that is this amazing and huge company, national company of oil in Brazil, started to be investigated as redistributing money of corruption to political parties. And in a matter of fact, the multi-partyism that has grown in a way that is completely crazy in Brazil. I told you, when Lula took office in 2002, there were 35 political parties in Brazil. Now we have more than 105 political parties. So in the last election, 73 new political parties were created. So as I told you, the main purpose of the whole majority of these parties is just stick to power and to gain money from corruption, from this multi-partyism. So before Lula, before Dilma, The only way to navigate politically and to be in charge in Brazil since the redemocratization in 1988 was to make alliances with these center parties in Brazil. And that's what happened. But in any way, Dilma was accused of corruption because she's never been convinced of corruption. But even so, the tendency was to impeach her, and she was impeached by the Congress and then by the Senate in 2016, and the vice president, what's his name?
Michel Temer.
Michel Temer took charge in 2016 to 2018. So some information. During the year 2010, 2012, 2014, Joe Biden, who was the vice president of the United States, came to Brazil and he visited Dilma Rousseff. And why? Maybe you remember of someone called Edward Snowden. Do you? Edward Snowden was the whistleblower who found out the NSA scandal. You remember that under the Obama administration, it was found that the NSA was spying on all American citizens and also was spying on many, many different governments all over the world. And one of the names that was revealed by the Snowden investigation and whistleblowing participation was Dilma Rousseff. So the United States were spying Brazil and were spying what was happening in Brazil. What was happening in Brazil, economically speaking? The discovery of the pre-sal. Pre-sal is an amazing, huge amount of reserve of oil off shores of Brazil. And with new technologies that were starting to be implemented by Petrobras, the national company of oil in Brazil, these amazing reserve of oil could be exploited in the coming years, which means today. Some people think, and when I say some people think, is I believe that if it took 50 years to have the official information and the evidence of the involvement of the United States in the 1964 coup, I fear that it will take many years, if not decades, to know about the true and direct involvement of the United States, of the CIA, in what happened in Brazil in the last 7 years. So in what extent? First of all, spying on two presidents, Lula and Dilma Rousseff. Second, having tight connections, tight connections with this judge that has been investigating these two presidents. And as I don't know if you know, but in 2018, President Lula could run again for office after the end of Michel Temer's term, and he was about to run again, because in Brazil you can run 2 terms, and then when there is an alternance, you can come back and try to run again. So President Lula, who left office in 2010 with 80 to 85% of approval, was building his candidacy, even being investigated for supposedly having received an apartment in the state of São Paulo, in the shores of São Paulo. And this judge has been trying to prove his guilt for 2-3 years, exactly at that time. And at the very limit of the moment that Lula could be candidate, his candidacy was invalidated, and when he went to prison. President Lula stayed in prison for more than 500 days. And what happened in the middle is the election of Jair Bolsonaro. Jair Bolsonaro belonged to the military. He was in office as a congressman in Rio, of the state of Rio, or as a congressman of Brazil for 21 years, I guess. Had only one law passed during 21 years in office. He is officially, and he brags to be homophobic, to be racist, misogynistic, and to, even worse, to be an apologist of the dictatorship and to be an apologist of torture. Bolsonaro, before being president, said that the only error that the military did during dictatorship is not to kill 30,000 people more. So it meant that people like Dilma Rousseff, who has struggled against the dictatorship and entered the armed forces against the dictatorship and was tortured, probably should have been killed by that time. So with Lula in prison and unable to run for presidency, finally, at the end of 2018, Jair Bolsonaro was elected. There's no way not to see that what he represents is an extreme right on the political spectrum, and in many ways a neo-fascist administration. So we have been living for almost the last 4 years under the administration of Jair Bolsonaro, and we need to understand that there is, beyond the influence of the United States, also obviously an international and global movement that takes many countries to the right or extreme right. You have Hungary with Viktor Orban, you have Italy, you have France with Marine Le Pen and Jean-Marie Le Pen and the extreme right. Obviously, the Trump presidency has been extremely important also. People who have helped President Trump to be elected have been directly in contact with the Bolsonaro campaign in 2018. And I'm thinking of Steve Bannon as an example of that. So once again, there is a connection between the right wing of the political spectrum in the United States, but also as a mainstream policy of the United States wanting to control Latin America, the rest of the Americas, and especially Brazil over the course of at least the last 60 years. And so that's what an amazing journalist, and I'm about to finish my presentation, has been investigating. And I would say that the major investigative journalists that we have had in Brazil over the course of the last 7 years since the coup d'etat against Dilma Rousseff is a US journalist. His name is Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald is a Pulitzer Prize winner. He is the one who has participated to the revelations of the Edward Snowden whistleblowers in the years 2010. And he came to live in Brazil after the Snowden case. He now lives in Rio de Janeiro. He is married, he is openly gay, and he is married to City Council of Rio, who belongs to a left party. And Glenn Greenwald is the one who has investigated Judge Sergio Moro for the last 7 years, his connections with the CIA and the United States, and mostly how he has put Lula in prison without any evidence. And as a consequence, in 2019, finally, President Lula was taken out of prison. And last year, it was proven that Judge Moro was completely partial and had no evidence at all to have a former president of Brazil that was about to be re-elected for a third term to be taken in prison. So we have to understand that what happened in Brazil since 1964 is nothing but normal. We have to understand and acknowledge that the United States, through its foreign policy, through the state, through the Central Intelligence Agency, through the NSA, have had direct influence on Latin America, and in the case we are talking about on Brazil. Since 1964, during the 1970s, and more recently, I would say the last 10 years. So we know that there is a US interest, obviously, in this amazing amount of oil, in aligning Brazil to US policy and to avoid that the left would come back to Brazil as a threat, like it happens and happened and still happens in Venezuela, for example, like it may have started to happen in Bolivia with Evo Morales, that was taken out of office also. And we know that Tesla, for example, Elon Musk had direct influence. So we need to understand that beyond governments, there is a transnational movement of billionaires that also have impacts, even on countries. Elon Musk bragged on the influence he had on the coup that removed Evo Morales in Bolivia. So what I believe is that the same way that the forces of white supremacy, of oppression, of structural racism and structural violence have been uniting over the last at least 60 years between Brazil and the United States, I am witnessing every day the union of people wanting to change politically what's happening in the United States and in Brazil. For 10 years, we have received Angela Davis here in Bahia at our university. She loves to come here. She is a symbol of the struggle of the minorities, like many other people, obviously, but I mean, she's still alive. So Angela Davis thinks and believes that there is a way to fight not only racism there and here, but also to fight the impact of imperialism on both sides. And I truly believe that it's of paramount importance to unite the people who want to address the questions regarding imperialism, regarding white supremacy, regarding structural racism and structural violence in the United States, in the Americas in general, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and in Brazil. And I do believe that Brazil, which is going through an amazing crisis in its history, that is historically violent and racist, has ways of uniting with people in the United States. And these two huge countries in the northern hemisphere of America and the southern hemisphere of here in South America have a role, have an obligation to struggle the extremely negative impacts of imperialism. So that's what I wanted to tell you, and I would be very happy to try to answer questions you may have or comments. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vatin. Yes, and so now as a move to questions, if you feel comfortable, I would like you to turn your cameras on, because it's always kind of difficult to talk to black boxes. So if you feel good about it, please do that. I'll say one thing, and then this hopefully can even lead to some more conversations. I would argue that so there is this international movement on the right, that is kind of well established at this point and kind of well documented. But I would argue that the physiological elites of Brazil miscalculated with car wash and with the removal of Juma and the removal of Lula from office, because they expected their candidates to come in and be able to get elected, right? And what happened was that gave the room for Bolsonaro with this, international ideology that's kind of already been established to come in with this narrative that had worked in the United States to come in and swoop in and win the election. So, the candidate of the center right that I think most people thought was going to win got 8% of votes, I think. on the first round. So even though Bolsonaro's election was a surprise, I think I mentioned to some of you in class before, like the day that Trump got elected in the United States, which was a surprise for me. I really thought he wasn't going to get elected. The day he was elected, I called, was like, Bolsonaro's going to be elected in Brazil. And at that time, he was polling at 3%, right? And my friend's like, no, that's crazy. I was like, nope, check it out. I'm not happy to be right, but it was because of this kind of like, this biggest implosion of the system that that led to the kind of the opening that he needed to really win the presidential election. So we'll see what happens. And you're all going to be in Brazil this year. It's pre-campaign period, but really people are campaigning already. So hopefully, yes, we're going to be able to see this when we are in Salvador. Who, in Salvador and Bahia in general has overwhelmingly voted for the Workers' Party throughout. Has been consistently a Workers' Party and kind of more, not just Workers' Party, but just left-leaning state. So it's also, as I kept talking about in class, right? We're going to one state in Brazil. This is not going to be a representation of the country. And in this case, especially, like Bahia has consistently been voting for the left, even to the left of the Workers' Party a lot of times, for communist parties, for socialist parties as well. So I'll stop talking here because I want to open for, other questions. And again, so for all my students, anybody can, of course, ask questions. So, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions. And for my students, it can be questions about the talk, but it can also be questions that you all came up from watching the documentaries and reading the articles that Dr. Vatin has recommended for us. So,
I just want to say I totally agree with you. It was a miscalculation, terrible miscalculation of the center right, and that they didn't expect, obviously, to have Bolsonaro in charge. And now we all pay the price.
I have a question. It kind of relates more to like religious influence and kind of how like the United States has influenced either like religion in Brazil or how like religion has influenced kind of this shift in the elections and like the shift in parties.
Yeah, that's a very important question, Haley. Thank you. So as I told you, Brazil is still officially the greatest, or at least in number, quantitatively in quantity, Catholic country on earth. But since the 1970s, the newborn Christians and the evangelical movement has been extremely strong. And it started with the influence. Obviously one more influence of the United States, because the televangelists of the 1970s that were so strong in the United States and the spreading of these new churches all around the world. It's not only Brazil, as you know, it's all over. I study on Africa and I can see the influence that these churches have had on the African continent. So in Brazil, the rise of the evangelicals, neo-evangelicals, is amazingly important. So it starts in 1974-75 with the creation of the Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus, the Universal Church of the Reign of God, that was funded by a Brazilian, Edir Macedo from Rio. As Pedro told you, Brazil is divided now. Politically speaking, the Northeast is historically on the left, and especially in the last years has been behind Lula and Dilma. Bahia is the state that most voted for the Workers' Party candidate in 2018. On the other side, on the southeast, which means Rio, São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and the south of Brazil, you have a majority of people who voted for Bolsonaro. And the state that has the biggest number of evangelical is Rio de Janeiro. And this is the state of Bolsonaro. And this is his basis, So you can see that these churches represent not only a religious movement, but now a political movement. So you have the bancada, which would be the caucus, the Bible, as we say, the Bible Caucus. So you have the bullet caucus, that would be the equivalent of the NRA, supporting guns, that we have strong now with Bolsonaro. And you have the, how do you say, cow caucus, that would be the agro industry, that is very strong. And the third, the third foot of these support that Bolsonaro has in Congress and in the political spectrum in Brazil is the Bible Caucus. So in 2018, almost all of these huge churches and pastors that are in control and that have many people in Congress supported Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro promised a Christian nation, and this did not start with Bolsonaro. In 2005, it was the year of Brazilian Friends, and I participated to many events there. And we made a documentary that showed that this huge church, which is one of the biggest, the Universal Church of the Reign of God, a Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus, here in Brazil, was planning to get to the presidency of Brazil in the years 2020. And that's almost what they got. Even under the Lula presidency, I told you, you cannot run this country without making alliances. And even the vice president of Lula was directly connected to one of those churches. So no matter what the scale, no matter what, if you're from left or right, the evangelicals now represent 30 to 32% of the Brazilian population. And they are together, but now they're split. After 3.5 years of Bolsonaro, I would say that half of evangelicals jumped out the ship and do not support Bolsonaro anymore. So in some ways, I don't think it's very appropriate to compare. But as I told you, the Catholic Church in the 1960s split in the 1970s between the right wing of the Catholic Church supporting dictatorship and the other side of the theology of liberation supporting the left against dictatorship. And I would say that what we may see this year in 2022 is a split between evangelicals, the one that will remain backing Bolsonaro because we have election in October, and the one that will support Lula. Because I forgot to tell you the good news, to me at least. Lula is going to be candidate this year, and in all polls that we have seen until now is in front, is a front runner. And he even at the beginning it would be could be elected in the first round, which will not be the case because I think the election would be more tight. But Lula is in front and obviously is turning towards the evangelical Christians to try to have at least a part of them backing his candidacy.
I shared a couple of links, one on the chat, but also all the things I share in the chat, I'm also sharing on Teams. So if you want to go back and look at it later, but those two things, one is like a really good book that just came out last year, or maybe 2 years ago, called Moral Majorities Across the Americas, which is talking about what Xavier just mentioned, which is this idea that the evangelical movement in Brazil is actually very connected to the U.S. movement, which is a new argument that was not really well developed before. And so the book makes a very convincing argument that that's the reality. And then I also added the PDF of my article on the Evangelical Caucus that talks about the evolution of Evangelical Caucus in Brazil. That that they went from having some power during the 1988 Constitutional Convention to basically being kingmakers now. They need to, Lula will need the support of the evangelicals if he wants to win, and not only that, he will need the support of them if he wants to govern, which creates, I mentioned this in class, this paradox or this conflict where it's a left-leaning party which supports LGBTQ rights, supports women's rights, but they have to the same time coalesce and at least align in some ways with a very conservative religious kind of sector of the population that may have diametrically opposed views of what policies should be. So yeah, so it's a very interesting kind of dynamic.
I was clicking on the links you sent us. Thank you.
I was wondering if you would be able to speak about how the oil crisis of the 1970s impacted Brazil.
So yes, I forgot to say that one of the ways that Brazil found to struggle against the 1970s oil crisis was interesting, because you can drive your car in Brazil until today and use alcohol. So as you know, sugarcane has been one of the first things to be exploited here on Brazilian soil after the Portuguese arrived, and that was one of the bases of this slavery. So there is an amazing amount of production of sugarcane in Brazil, and sugarcane was obviously at the beginning used for sugar, and then for cachaça, which is the alcohol which is typical from Brazil. And I think, and Pedro will tell me, I think in the 1970s was when it started to be used as an alternative to oil to make Brazil more independent of the crisis. And so that's when these new energy for cars and was used, and it's used until today. And even if you buy oil here in Brazil, 25% of this oil is mixed with alcohol. So you need special car to run here in Brazil, because I wouldn't think your normal car for normal oil would run easily here in Brazil. It would have, it would be coughing maybe because of oil. So that was one of the ways of struggling. And obviously the program that was the Alliance for Progress in the 1960s and 1970s was almost the equivalent of the Marshall Plan for Latin America. So the United States also have been helping Brazil during all the time of dictatorship to have these so-called economic miracle that was supposedly happening during dictatorship. And that makes that some people that have lived this period would feel even nostalgia about this dictatorship era, because supposedly, economically speaking, it was better than after. I don't know if I answered exactly to the question.
Yeah, so and one thing that's interesting and conflicting when it comes to this idea of economic development and the role of the military is that it was only because the military was able to impose this on people, because ethanol run cars in the 70s and 80s were not efficient, right? But the military in a way kind of forced the companies to start developing this technology, which allowed Brazil to now be on the forefront of these discussions, right? So and two things that happened in Brazil specifically were with that, the development of alternative fuel. Now again, it's not to say that ethanol is actually environmentally more friendly than oil. There's a lot of debates about that specifically, right? But also, Brazil Petrobras, which was the Brazilian petroleum company, was a pioneer in offshore drilling. I don't think that many people know that the offshore drilling technology that is used in most countries now is actually developed in Brazil, because we knew that there was more oil in offshore, and it's much more expensive and much more dangerous actually to extract oil from there. So we're almost out of time. So I actually wanted to spend the last time on kind of more of a fun note. As I think in my class I've been focusing a lot on music, on Brazilian music, to kind of introduce them to the culture. And I asked Xavier his favorite Brazilian song, and I won't play it here because I want to put this on YouTube, and there's copyright issues that come with that, right? But I want Xavier to talk a little bit about it. I'll share the link on the chat of the song, so you can listen to it later. But it's also on Teams. So yeah, so maybe Xavier, can you talk a little bit about like the song and like kind of how that how that connects to you?
Yes, Pedro. So I fell in love with Brazil when I was 8 years old, and my mother went to Brazil, and she came back with a lot of cassette and records and photographs, and I fell in love with Brazilian music. So there is music that was made in 1979 during dictatorship called O Bêbado e a Equilibrista by a Brazilian singer and musician called João Bosco, who wrote his songs with someone who was writing the lyrics. He was an amazing poet, and they both fought against dictatorship. And this music, O Bêbado e a Equilibrista, was the first Brazilian song I learned. I'm French. I came here for the first time. I was 21 years old in 1992. So Brazil was a dream country to me. You know, I was dreaming of this country since I was a child, and I learned 10 and 20 or 100 Brazilian songs by heart, but without understanding anything, just phonetically. And this music, O Bêbado e a Equilibrista, I hope you like it. You can listen to it later. It is an amazing critique of the dictatorship. And obviously during dictatorship, there was censorship. So you needed to write a lyric that was able to, you know, to not be caught by censorship. And it took me 3 decades to understand the real meaning of this song. You know, after living in Brazil, after speaking maybe fluently Portuguese, and for some people who had been under dictatorship to tell me the true meaning of this lyric. And I think what's beautiful too, in the original version by João Bosco, 1979, that I used to sing all day in France without knowing the meaning, was it is a samba, and it is a very happy samba. So I think this is an expression of what is, to me, the most amazing expression of Brazil, resilience. Brazilian people are extremely resilient. They are able to live and to be happy to live even under the worst situations. And I know that to many people in Brazil, it's not necessarily a good side, because people say, well, people accommodate and people don't struggle and people don't make revolution. But I would say no French people would be able to live for decades in Brazil. I mean, it's not easy when you come from a country that is stable, that has, you know, so many help from the government like we do have in France. So I admire how people in Brazil are resilient. And this music, which sounds musically so happy, is deep in the history of this country, that the people of Brazil have been struggling and have been suffering the suffering. And this is the history of samba. It's how to transform the suffering into something that is joy. And so, yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks so much. And I typed on the chat, like, you know, the translation would be the drunkard and a tightrope walker, right? As the translation of the song. So again,
and the song was starting as a tribute to Charles Chaplin, who had just died. And so at the beginning, on some version, you can hear "Smile," this amazing, beautiful, you know, theme of Charles Chaplin, because he was a composer too. And so they start with "Smile" by Charles Chaplin, and then you go to samba. And yeah, that's a beautiful connection also between the, you know, the English speaking world and the global world represented by Charlie Chaplin and Brazil. So I can't wait to meet you all in Bahia here next month.
Yeah, that's right. It's next month.
You know, my students at my university, I just meet them still like we do now. You know, we're not back in person, and so you will be from the United States the first students I have in person next month. So I'm very excited about that. Happy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xavier, and thank you all for coming. So again, I will send you all an email later on kind of updating kind of what the schedule is for these days, but we'll continue this. So there's a checkout that should be available now for you to do. And it is
Can
just
we take a picture
reflection of
together?
this. Yeah.
All together? If some would just turn the camera on for a second.
Yeah, if everybody who can turn the camera on real quick, and then you take a screenshot.
Great. Okay. Betty, Laurent, Fabian. Okay, maybe some are on the table too. Let's try to. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. I'll send you the picture.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, so I'll see you all later. Thank you, Xavier, and I'm excited to meet you in person.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.